Hey, welcome everyone to a new episode of Swift Community. This time my guest is Hélène Shapiro. Welcome, Hélène.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I think it's going to be a very exciting episode today because we are going to talk about a topic that I think most of us in iOS we might not be that familiar with, and it's GraphQL and how we can basically integrate GraphQL APIs in iOS apps.
Yep.
So before we get started, Hélène, maybe you can tell us in a few words. You're working at Apollo, which is a company that edits software to deal with GraphQL on iOS and I think on other platforms. Can you tell us maybe a few words about this?
Apollo GraphQL is a company that has its own stack of GraphQL servers and clients. We have a server that's mostly in Node. We have some other things going on as well. But we also have a web client, an iOS client, and an Android client. The Android client also supports some non-Android things that run on the JVM. It also supports Kotlin native, which has now sort of been rebranded as Kotlin multi-platform mobile. And so that means that there are ways to use it not only on the Android client, but also on on iOS as well. So it's pretty neat stuff. If you're into Kotlin native, there's definitely there's some learning curve around that, but the iOS SDK itself is all Swift and things of that nature.
Well, that's super interesting, and I'm really excited that we are going to check out how this works because personally, I know a little bit what GraphQL is. I might have heard like very slightly about Apollo, but nothing more. So I think I'm like most of the viewers. I have everything to learn for in this episode. So
Yeah.
let's go to the screen sharing scene and we can check out a demo project. So can you tell us what is this screen?
So what this screen is a thing that you can actually load up on most GraphQL servers. It's called Graphical or GraphIQL, depending on who's pronouncing it. It's a way of being able to look at your server and what's been defined as properties and queries that you can look at. So one thing that's really helpful is that we've got these two tabs where you can look at your schema. So you can look at sort of like what are the actual definitions of different things, and you can see the exact type definitions and things like that. And then they also have the docs tab, which allows you to sort of go through, look at the different pieces of information that have been defined with any inline doc comments that are just rendered live. So that's really helpful for being able to sort of tell like what is available to me in this wide world of craziness. So let me try to, okay. So I'm like, how do I actually get rid of this? But there's not super great way. So there's three different types of operations with GraphQL. There's queries, which is where you sort of ask for something. There's mutations where you ask to change something. And then there's subscriptions where you're asking the server to update you anytime something has changed. And so the most common one is queries. So in this case, this is sort of a SpaceX type API that looks at sort of like, hey, what launches are available? And then if you look at, you can also find out like what is a particular launch that is available. So a couple of things to note here. This query, it returns a particular type. So if you are querying for a single launch, you get a launch. And then if you're querying for the list of launches, you get this launch connection thing that allows for pagination and things like this. The other nice thing about this documentation is that you're able to see, okay, what even is a launch connection, and then sort of dive deeper into what are the different pieces that are in this launch connection type. So all of these types are defined as part of the schema. The schema you can sort of think of as like, here's a roadmap of what is even possible. Here are the types that are being used. Here are the ways that you can ask for them. And then, you start with sort of really basic building blocks like, string and ID and Boolean, and you compose them all together. So in this case, looking at this launch type, you've got an ID type, you've got a string type, and then you've got this mission type. It's like, oh, what is that? Well, here is a mission type where it has, that has a string and that has a patch size. And then what's a patch size? You can look further down and you can say, okay, a patch size is either small or large. And you can define enumerations. You can define unions, which is basically like, here are several types that could be returned from one particular query. But it's definitely something where you're able to sort of get a much better idea of what is coming to you when you are making any kind of request. So another big difference here is that there's all these queries, but none of these have like a specific endpoint. These are all like you'll sort of see in the URL here. There's no like slash user slash launches or whatever like that. It's just all one huge endpoint. And what happens is that the way that you query it is that you make a post to that endpoint, and I'm going to close that up, with a query or a mutation or a subscription. So what you do is you sort of say, okay, in this docs, I have launch, and I know that that returns a launch, and then I can get the site, then I can get the mission. The mission then has a name, and then the rocket itself has a name. And you can basically say, okay, I don't necessarily need to know like the ID or the type of the rocket. I only need to know the name. And when you say, okay, give me the information for launch number 80, you can use this little play button to actually run this query with any query variables that you have. And then it will give you the data that you've asked for. So this is sort of the big thing with GraphQL is that you're able to structure like, what are you asking for? So you can say, okay, I want the launch. And then you can see that as you've requested all of these different properties, that structure is completely mirrored in the data that you get back. So because you're able to know that that's what's happening, that's where our iOS SDK comes in, because what that allows us to do is generate a bunch of code in Swift to deal with the parsing, to deal with like translating everything into JSON, to send and receive everything. And to also sort of give you this type safe way of accessing all of this stuff. So I'm going to go into, so this is our sample application that is built over the course of our tutorial, and it's called Rocket Reserver, and it's hitting that same
API, I guess.
Yeah. And so it's something where, okay, so we've got this launch details, and it has an ID. So one of the things that happens is you have to do a lot of setup to get there, but once you're able to take advantage of our code generation tools, you can have these API.swift files that get generated, and you get this launch detail. So if you look at sort of this query, you can say, okay, so it's launch details and it takes an ID. And so the initializer that gets constructed is for an ID. And it is able to actually say, okay, I can give you this type safe definition. I can also tell you that because this has the query keyword, this is a query. And then when the data is returned, you get some fun stuff under the hood. But what it allows you to do is say, okay, I got a launch, and this launch is going to have the ID, the site, the mission, the rocket, and is booked. And then it will allow you to sort of access all of these really easily in a much cleaner way at the call site than it is here in the generated code.
And so maybe just to make sure, so the code that you have shown us in the API file, is it generated code or is it written by hand?
That is completely machine generated. And I know that we've had a couple of people be like, oh my God, there's exclamation points in it. One of the things that we're doing under the hood, and this is sort of an implementation detail for right now, but it is something that's worth knowing about, like why there's exclamation points. So we know from the query that there will be, in anything that's returned that isn't an error, there will be a property called ID that's in sort of this underlying result map, which is basically a dictionary. And then we also know from the type information from the schema that it's going to be a GraphQL ID. And essentially we can force unwrap this because we know it's going to be there. We know what kind it's going to be. And if it's the wrong kind, that's a serious violation of the GraphQL contract. Like, this is sort of something where, let me go back to Chrome for a second. This schema can also be thought of as a bit of a contract. So when you say, okay, I want to look at this query, and if you say, okay, I want a launch, and you ask for a launch back and it gives you back a mission instead of a launch, that is a violation of that contract, because it basically means your your backend has decided to completely change the shape of what's happening. And I think this is a thing that I ran into a decent amount with REST APIs that I didn't have any control over, where just, the people who were maintaining it would make a change, and you would be able to sort of say, okay, well, clearly the shape of the data changed. Like, unless they've actually really gone through and updated their documentation, there's not really a good way of understanding what the changes were, how they worked, what was going on. And with GraphQL, all that sort of change management is kind of baked into the spec. You can't get rid of something without deprecating it first. I mean, you can, but like literally everything's going to blow up. So it is not recommended. It's something where that deprecation process allows you to sort of say, okay, we're going to be removing this stuff so that we're only going to get rid of it when basically everybody stops using a particular version. So like that's the way that that sort of change management happens within GraphQL. So it's, like I said, it's much easier to add stuff than it is to sort of take stuff out. But it is something where, because you don't have this thing where it's like, okay, I have one endpoint and it has piece of information A, B, and C, and then I have another endpoint and it has B, C, and D. You don't, if you need piece of information D on the first endpoint, usually like what you have to do is be like, hey guys, like I need you to add this to this endpoint, and then it like takes like a week or a month or something, and it just is like really difficult. With GraphQL, if you decide like, hey, like I've been asking for just the rocket's name, and I also decide I need the ID, then you just add ID in, and as soon as you hit that button again, it gives you back the ID.
So that's the big
And
feature, is that, like you said, instead of having like a set of endpoints, you only have one big endpoint, and you could say like you define by your query what you're going to get. So that's the big advantage of
yeah,
GraphQL.
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's definitely something, when people talk about the graph in GraphQL, they're talking more about sort of like mathematical graph theory and computer science graph theory. And one of the things to think about with sort of how this works versus REST is that REST is you're sort of like, please give me this information. And then with GraphQL, you're able to specify exactly what it is you want. And like if you've ever had an endpoint that you hit where you just get a whole bunch of things where it's like, well, this is only used on the website, or this is used like 3 screens down that the user may never even go to. That's the kind of information where GraphQL can help, is you don't have to get that information until you actually need it. And that can be really helpful for, your users' data bills, like the any kind of processing that you need to do. If you don't have to parse a bunch of JSON that you're just going to drop on the floor the second you're done parsing it, that really is helpful for both networking and battery life to just not
Definitely.
have to do that. And then, like I said, the other thing is that, so like if I were, okay, so in this, where's the launch detail? So we've got this launch details, and you can see that it's got the name and type of the rocket. So if you go into your detail view controller, which is where that's actually happening, you can actually see, so the property that's coming in here is actually just launch details query dot data, which is the information that's returned dot launch.
And this
And so
type,
that's,
it's part of the code that has been generated, right?
yes, that's been generated for you so that it's already parsed, it's already typed and ready to go. And then we've got this sort of configure view thing, which first basically checks to make sure that like the storyboard is actually woken up, and then it makes sure that there actually is a launch. And then it starts to actually configure everything from what's going on within the particular query. You can see that here we've got if let rocket name and let rocket type. Let's see what happens if I try to do, because we know that rockets have an ID. So we say let rocket ID equal launch dot rocket dot, and if I tried to type ID, this won't even compile. Yeah, because you haven't actually requested the ID in this particular query. And that's sort of a way that we use Swift's type system to enhance what GraphQL already gives you, so that you basically are able to say, I know whether this is going to be here or not. And or at least whether I've requested it. For things where let me go back to, so if I go back to, one thing I want to talk about is optionals. So all of this stuff is declared in a thing called schema definition language. And one thing about schema definition language is it's kind of based on TypeScript. And a thing to understand about GraphQL schemas is that everything by default is optional. So in the case of GraphQL, it's considered nullable. And so if you want something to be non-null, that's when you have to throw an exclamation point in there. So what our code generation does is when it sees that, like, okay, it's like ID is definitely going to be there, it generates that as a non-optional, non-null type. So that it knows, like, yeah, that's going to be there for sure. And then name and type, even if they're requested, they could be null. So that's generated as an optional. And that allows you to have a lot more information about sort of like, okay, like, what are some things that I might need to do in order to do some additional formatting? So like in this case, I'm checking for the rocket name and the rocket type. And if they're there, we display that information. And if they're not, we display no. So I'm going to launch this. Let's see if, oh yes, my awesome iPod Touch 7th generation. So it's loading the information. So it's grabbed a bunch of stuff. And then if I go into that, so it's got this nice little, like, you can sort of see where I have the rocket name and the rocket type, and if it's there, so it has a little rocket emoji. So that's definitely there. So it's like a Falcon 9 FT. Woo!
Perfect.
So that's something where having the ability to tell not just what have you asked for, but also if you've asked for it, are you sure it's going to be there or not? Being able to tell all that at build time just saves a lot of time. It's something where essentially what we're trying to do is take as many foot guns away from this as possible. And there's certainly other ones that appear, but it's something where it's just like, you want to be able to have confidence that your application is going to give you back the information that you've asked for. And we're able to say, okay, if you tell us what your query is, we can actually translate that into a type safe type as you're working through it. And then we can tell you, like, okay, as you're typing, here are the places that you need to potentially do other handling because this may or may not actually be here.
And what I'm wondering when I see this code is, so let's say that the query that we have in our application, it's a query that the backend cannot answer, maybe because we are asking for a property that does not exist. What's going to happen then? Will the network call fail?
Yes. So you can kind of see that so one thing that's nice is with either GraphQL, or I'm going to show a second tool in a minute that helps with this. If you try to add something that is not, so if let's say I do destination, and you can see it like doesn't fill something in.
Yeah.
And then there's like a little error here that says, like, if you cannot query field destination on type mission. So you find that stuff out much more quickly. And like, if you just try to send that, it's like
you get an error.
You get that error immediately saying that the GraphQL validation failed. So it's basically something where, we're able to say, and like, let's say I tried to do that on launch details. So if I, instead of saying, so I say destination. So what will happen with our code generation is that it will actually compare the schema that you have downloaded locally to what you're trying to request. And it will actually show you, okay, error, cannot query field destination on type mission. So you actually know that, and like, it won't even let you build if you try to do something that isn't like there.
That's super nice.
This is also helpful for preventing typos, which I am a major source of typos in the
I think we all are,
GraphQL. GraphQL code base. But like, like if you accidentally put 2 A's in name, it's like, what? I don't know what that is. So it's definitely something where, like, it's more about sort of saying, like, here is the contract that we have for what is supposed to be happening. And are you following that contract? If yes, Like, here's a bunch of cool free stuff. If you're not following that contract, we want that to blow up in your face as quickly as possible so that you can figure out what's incorrect and fix it.
That makes sense.
And that's sort of the biggest thing. We also have this thing. So this is sort of the basic thing that's included with everything, is graphical. Apollo has a thing that you can sign up for called Explorer. That allows you to do some fun stuff in terms of like just being able to like click on things and have things show up. So it's just like, okay, I want to have my profile image like just added randomly to a query. Like it's really fun stuff. There's a feature that you can sign up for where it can basically pull that from anything that has a introspection endpoint available to you. So this is actually hitting this same website that this is being displayed from. It's just nice and fancy, and you can find out a lot of information. And then like obviously if you're like a lot of the stuff is free, and then there's obviously more features that we add if you are a paying client, because we are a company that does want to. We do want to make money.
Like everyone else.
Yeah, but I think it's definitely something where like I've found this to be super helpful, and I think it is something where you also can get a good look at your schema. You can get similar pieces of information in terms of like what are the objects that are defined, like, and these are sort of like particular types of scalars that are available to you, particular enums that are defined. So it's like it's got some additional features in there that make it a little easier to take a look through it.
Kind of like interactive documentation and query builder. So
yeah,
super nice.
Yeah, definitely. And it's definitely something where we've tried to get sort of the best of the features from graphical, but then really just sort of extend it more to be more specific to what Apollo itself can do versus what GraphQL on its own can do.
That makes sense. And so to conclude the episode, maybe have two questions regarding how everything is integrated in the iOS app. So my first question would be, what are actually, we could say, like the artifacts that we need to embed in the app? We've seen the GraphQL file, we've seen the schema. Is there something else, or is it just this?
So the good news is that you don't actually have to embed the GraphQL file itself. So if you actually look at, let's see, it's like I can have these not even in the target because they are only used in order to generate this API.swift file.
Oh, okay.
So the only thing that you have to put into your application is the generated code. There is a way to generate it as multiple files instead of one giant file. I do know that we've had some people who have like really enormous files that are just like, apparently the Swift compiler, like once something gets to like 10 or 11,000 lines, it's just like, what are you doing? So yeah, but it's really nice because particularly for places where you have a really big schema, you don't have to include the schema with the application, which means that like you just don't have to have this fairly large file that is included in your application. So that's super nice. So yeah, like that's sort of like what gets generated with the application itself. A lot of the work that sort of goes into making this happen is the code generation piece of it. It's sort of, we take the way that I have sort of put it is sort of that the schema plus the operations is the code. So, the schema defines what is possible to do. The operations are what am I actually trying to do? And then we sort of run a validation step that says, okay, is what you're trying to do actually possible? And if it passes that, then we're able to generate the code and say, okay, this is now something that is actually possible to represent in code. And, you don't have to create the model objects. You don't have to do anything around parsing because we've already done all of that. And yeah, that's basically, that's basically our value proposition.
Yeah, it's a very nice value proposition, definitely. And it leads to my second question, which is, so we've seen what we need to embed, we could say, as the data. And now in terms of dependencies, maybe of custom build steps, how do we integrate this SDK Apollo in an iOS project?
Yeah, so this is something that I'm hoping will get much better with some forthcoming changes to Swift Package Manager. But for right now, what you do is you can either use, let's see, what have I even got with this gun? So yeah, so this is definitely something where it's just like using this with Swift Package Manager can be with sort of our older setup, which is what this is set up with. This is set up with our underlying TypeScript library being used directly. There's a more recent version of this that actually allows you to, here, I'm going to open the actual Apollo project because this is, so I can show that here. Apollo, oh no, wait, Star Wars API is where that's going to be. Build phases. So what this is actually doing is it's running a little script that's been written in Swift. That doesn't want to let me change the size of anything, but it actually allows you to run different code generation build steps. And then that's something where you're able to write a bunch of the code that you need to sort of say, okay, these are where my files are. These are where everything else is. That's all something that you can write in Swift. So what this is I've just opened this package.swift file in this folder called Swiftscripts. This is actually a little sort of multi-purpose thing that I've put together for the Apollo application, but we're actually dog fooding the code generation build step. But what you can do is you can basically say, okay, where are you? You're able to say, okay, here are all of the different things that we need to do. And then eventually you can get to this point where you actually try to generate the code using our code generation. And so one of the reasons that I've written this sort of Swift wrapper is that we are working on rewriting a bunch of our code generation to be in Swift rather than in JavaScript, which is where it is now. This has been a project. This has been something that's been going on for months. And I think I'm really, really happy that we have Anthony Miller on board, who is a really, really sharp engineer, and he has done tons of work with GraphQL. That is the great news. The bad news is, like, one of the first things he did was find a piece of my assumptions for what I was working on that's like, oh yeah, this isn't going to work at all. Like, not even just like, oh, we can change this and like make it different. It's like, nope, this is literally not possible. So that was fun, but it's definitely one of those things where the stuff that he's been working on most recently is really, really cool. And I think it's gonna make working with the code gen a lot easier. I think one of the things that's been a blessing for the Android team and a little bit of a problem for the iOS team is that the Android team has always they've sort of gotten some stuff where they were getting stuff done under the hood in terms of parsing and validation being done by the TypeScript SDK. And then their actual code generation was in either Java or Kotlin. We actually are generating the code under the hood with the TypeScript. So it means anytime that we need to make a change to the code generation, we have to dive into TypeScript, which is not my favorite thing to do. Let's just put it that way. As with many things, I don't like it because I'm bad at it. And it's something where I would love to be able to take much more time to get better at it. But in terms of like how many other things need to get done on the Apollo side, like being like, well, let me take 2 months and learn how TypeScript works is like not really on my list. But yeah, it's something where what we're going to be able to do is over time sort of say, okay, you can have some of these options where you can start to use the Swift code generation if you want to use it earlier. If you don't want to use it earlier, then you don't have to. And then once it's actually at a point where we've done the full cutover to the Swift code generation, then like basically we'll just swap it out from under you and be done. So that's the main reason that this all exists. And this is going to be the main way to do it going forward. What I'm really hoping is that there's a new Swift evolution proposal. Where did I put that? It is, I think it's 303. Yeah. Package manager extensible build tools. This would be fantastic. This is really like, basically it allows you to do stuff, and like the example design for all this, where is it? Like types of build commands.
It's a big
example
proposal.
1. It's a huge proposal, but a bunch of the examples are SwiftGen, and then like other Swift protobuf, other things that need code generation as part of the build process are basically the textbook examples for what this is built for. So that would be super helpful if that goes through. Think it's still in review, or at least the review ended yesterday, is I think what the schedule is. Yeah, April 14 to 26. So it's something where if that comes through, that's going to be an enormous help. I'm not 100% convinced it's going to come through at WWDC, but it's definitely something where just like that would make our lives an awful lot easier. I don't know what it would mean for how we do things with CocoaPods and Carthage, but at least for Swift Package Manager, it would make a bunch of stuff way easier.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine. All right, so thank you, Helen. I think it has been a
Thank you.
very interesting episode. We've seen what GraphQL is, we've seen how we can integrate GraphQL with iOS, and the best part is that we've seen that once we have a GraphQL query, well, almost everything is generated for us in a very type-safe way. So indeed, like when you have a backend that is compatible with GraphQL, you have like there is few downside to using it with GraphQL in your iOS app.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to pretend that this is a hammer that can solve every nail. But this is definitely something that once I found out about GraphQL and started learning about it, I was just like, oh my God, why hasn't anybody done this way before?
Yeah.
Like this seems just a lot clearer. And the obvious answer is like, well, we didn't really know that we wanted to do it this way until we did it all of these other ways. It's always an evolution. But I think it is something where I really see this as a tremendously flexible, helpful way to be able to get information from a server in a reliable way that keeps your app from blowing up. And like ultimately, that's what we all want. So.
Yeah, I agree that this way of interacting with the backend just on itself it seems very and it feels very elegant, but when you combine it with how it works with Swift's type system, yeah, it really feels like you might not have the silver bullet, but you're getting kind of close to it still.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge improvement is what I'll say. I think there's definitely I'm very much of the opinion that there are no silver bullets, because something that's a silver bullet for one person makes the job absolutely impossible for somebody
Exactly.
else. But I think there's a reason that GraphQL is so popular right now. Like it's particularly on the web, it's just allowing things to evolve so much faster. The other thing that's really nice is if you're doing prototyping and like you need to use you want to make changes to like a profile screen, you're able to see like what are all of the properties of the user that are available in one place. And not only are you able to see that, you can actually give that to like a designer and say like, hey, look, these are all the properties of what this is available. Here are all of the things that you could possibly put on the screen. And that's immensely helpful. And it's really, really, really good for like being able to have a better idea of what data is even available to you than I think is really possible with the way that most REST APIs are structured. I think REST definitely has some stuff that it's better at, especially if you're just doing like crazy amounts of optimization on something where like, okay, it's going to be exactly this data. That's sort of one of the trade-offs of GraphQL is you get flexibility. And there are places where if you have a really, really enormous query, you might need more performance than GraphQL can give you. But in about 99% of cases, like the trade-off for the flexibility is absolutely worth it.
So I can only hope that while after watching this video, you are curious to check out more about GraphQL. So of course, all of the things that Helen talked about, all the links are in the description just below. So you can go check out those links. And I think we can only encourage you to keep on learning and maybe even more important, just experimenting with GraphQL, trying to run the demo project, following the tutorial, and see if it makes sense for you to use it in your app either now or sometime in the future. So thank you all for watching the episode. Thank you, Helen, for being my guest today. Hope to see you again for another video.
Yeah, I hope to see you in person one of these years.
I hope we get to see each other in person one of these days. It's been like a long time, definitely. So thank you all for watching. See you next time.
Bye.